Archive 13, The Thallium Kitchen, the Kyiv Cafeteria Poisoner, and the Silence That Let Her Kill. Introduction. The soup was still warm when the first child collapsed. Winter, 1986. A school cafeteria in Kyiv. The air smelled of cabbage broth and floor wax and something else. Something metallic, thin as a wire, that nobody could quite name. Students sat in rows beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below irritation. Spoons scraped bowls. A teacher laughed at something near the window. By that evening, the burning had started. Throats tightened, fingers went numb at the tips. By morning, the first ambulances had come and gone, their sirens cutting through streets still thick with January fog. Nobody understood what they were looking at. That was precisely the point. The case that unfolded over the following months would expose one of the Soviet Union's most methodical and most overlooked killers, a cafeteria attendant named Tamara Ivanyutina, who had turned the daily ritual of feeding people into a private instrument of execution. Her weapon was thallium, a heavy metal so rarely tested for that it could strip a person of their hair, their nerve function, and finally, their life, while doctors charted the decline as heart failure or mysterious illness. She operated inside a system built on silence, a society where official newspapers did not print inconvenient truths, where a doctor who raised the wrong question risked his own career, where the machinery of state preferred the appearance of order to the admission of disorder. It was a perfect environment for a poisoner. Decades later, the files survive, the hospital logs, the toxicology reports, stamped with red ink that nobody acted on fast enough, the psychiatric evaluations that describe a woman who felt no guilt, only a settled conviction that her victims had deserved exactly what they received. This is the story of what she did, who she killed, how long it took anyone to stop her, and how ordinary it all looked, right until the end. Every file in this archive is real. Leave a comment. Tell us which case we should open next. Cold cases, true records, nothing buried. Chapter 1. The World Before. In a society that punishes transparency, the person who hides best is not necessarily the most dangerous, but they are the most durable. Dr. Yuri Antonyan, Soviet criminologist, Psychology of the Hidden Offender, 1991. Kyiv in the early 1980s smelled of diesel exhaust and damp concrete, and, on certain mornings near the Dnieper, something green and alive fighting its way through the gray. The city was orderly in the way that pressure makes things orderly. Gray apartment blocks stood in mathematically precise rows across districts like Darnitsia and Obolon. Factory shifts started on time because tardiness had consequences. School cafeterias followed state-approved recipes measured to the gram, not for nutrition, but for accounting. Every ladle of soup was a line in a ledger somewhere. Hierarchy was the architecture of daily life. Housing, promotions, access to goods, all of it flowed through the same narrow channels of institutional favor. A wrong word to the wrong supervisor could mean losing your place on the apartment waiting list. A complaint filed against you could stall a promotion for years. People learned early to track the social landscape with the precision of surveyors. Tamara Ivanyutina tracked it better than most. She lived in one of those concrete blocks in a flat that neighbors described as clean and unremarkable. She worked as a cafeteria attendant, a position of almost no formal status but considerable practical power. She decided who received an extra ladle. She controlled what went into the pot. In a society where food access was itself a form of authority, the kitchen was not a trivial space. Colleagues remembered her as quiet, watchful, quick to register any slight and slow to let it go. The archives record no dramatic criminal history before 1980, no arrests, no formal complaints. What they record instead is a woman who kept meticulous internal ledgers, not financial, but social. Every perceived insult cataloged, every slight weighed and stored. She did not confront people directly. She waited. Fact: thallium was used in Soviet-era industrial processes, particularly in the production of certain optical glass components and as a rodenticide. Workers in metallurgical facilities had access to thallium sulfate compounds that were not subject to the same controls as pharmaceutical substances. This institutional gap in chemical tracking would become critical. The city around her operated on the assumption that its systems worked, that food was safe because food preparation was regulated. that if something went wrong, someone with authority would notice and act. Those assumptions were about to be tested. Chapter 2. Early Warning Signs. Poisoners rarely begin with murder, they begin with control. The poison is just the final expression of a psychology that was already there, waiting. Dr. Natalia Bogdanova, forensic psychiatrist, Hidden Violence in Closed Systems, Moscow State University Press, 1998. The childhood files on Tamara Ivanyutina are thin. This itself is a kind of data. What survives from school records and later witness statements, assembled during the 1987 investigation, sketches a portrait familiar to forensic psychologists, though nobody was looking for the pattern at the time. Teachers noted that she held grudges beyond what any situation seemed to warrant. Minor conflicts that other children forgot by the next week stayed fresh and sharp in her memory for months. A former classmate, interviewed by investigators in 1987, described an incident from their school years. A girl had taken a seat that Ivanyutina considered hers. The dispute was trivial. The response was not. Within days, the girl became ill after eating food that Ivanyutina had been near. The illness passed. No one reported it. No one connected it. It was the first signature, hidden inside ordinary school day friction. By adulthood, the pattern had calcified. She married and later divorced. The details of the marriage are sparse in the public record, but what investigators later characterized as her absolute intolerance for any challenge to her sense of rightful order would have made close cohabitation difficult. She moved through several workplace kitchens, each posting generating its own catalog of complaints. Colleagues recalled her fixation on what she considered proper procedure, but procedure as she defined it, not as the rule books described it. If a supervisor corrected her method, the correction was not absorbed as information. It was registered as aggression. Myth versus reality. Myth. Poisoners are exotic, theatrical figures, the eccentric chemist, the glamorous widow. Reality. The majority of documented serial poisoners in institutional settings are described by those around them as mundane, even dull. Their violence is invisible by design. Ivanyutina's neighbors and colleagues consistently described her as unremarkable. That unremarkability was not coincidental, it was operational. A forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the complete case file in the late 1990s, Dr. Natalia Bogdanova of Moscow State University's criminology faculty, wrote that Ivanyutina's psychological profile showed what she termed a closed retaliatory system. Anger entered but never exited through normal social channels. It accumulated. It found another outlet. The kitchen was always close at hand. What the record does not show is anyone who recognized this for what it was. Not the teachers who noted the grudges, not the colleagues who remembered the complaints, not the supervisors who probably dismissed her as difficult. Difficult people are everywhere. Most of them do not poison anyone. The question the case would eventually force was a harder one. How do you identify the one who will before she does? Chapter 3. The First Crime. The first killing is rarely the most violent. It is the most significant. It is the moment the internal threshold is crossed and found to be crossable. Robert Hare, Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us, Guilford Press, 1993. The man's name was Gennady Ivanovich Komarov. He was 54 years old. He repaired pipes. He lived in the same apartment block as Tamara Ivanyutina, in the kind of proximity that Soviet housing policy enforced on people who would never have chosen each other as neighbors. They shared a laundry space in the basement, a damp, low-ceilinged room that smelled of mildew and detergent and old concrete. It was not a comfortable space in the best of circumstances. As a site of ongoing territorial dispute, it was quietly exhausting. The argument between Komarov and Ivanyutina over use of the shared laundry area had been running for months by the time 1983 arrived. Neighbors were vaguely aware of it, the way people are aware of background noise. Present, unpleasant, apparently manageable. Nobody intervened. Nobody needed to. Or so it seemed. In the early spring of 1983, Komarov accepted a cup of tea from Ivanyutina during what witnesses later described as an apparent attempt at reconciliation. The gesture was unremarkable. In Soviet apartment culture, tea was social currency. The extension of a cup implied, at minimum, a temporary truce. He drank it. Within 48 hours, Gennady Komarov was ill. The symptoms arrived in stages, the way thallium poisoning always does, its progression as methodical as a checklist. First came the gastrointestinal distress, nausea, cramps, the body trying to expel something it couldn't identify. Then the neurological effects began their slow advance. His hands tingled, his feet went unreliable beneath him. He complained of a burning sensation that moved from his extremities inward, like a fire working toward the center of a building. He was admitted to hospital. Doctors noted his deteriorating condition and charted it under categories they understood: cardiac stress, possible viral illness, the kinds of diagnoses that fill Soviet-era hospital ledgers from the period. The question of poison was not raised. Thallium poisoning was not something Kyiv district physicians tested for routinely. It mimicked other things too well. Gennady Komarov died 11 days after drinking the tea. The death certificate listed cardiac failure as the cause. His family buried him. The laundry dispute, from the official record's perspective, simply ended. Fact: thallium sulfate has a lethal dose of approximately 10 to 15 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, but serious neurological damage can occur at much lower doses. It has no taste. It dissolves readily in liquid. Hair loss, alopecia, typically begins 10 to 21 days after ingestion, frequently after the patient has already been discharged or died. In 1983 Soviet Ukraine, thallium was not included in standard toxicological screening panels. A deliberate poisoning could pass through the entire medical system undetected. The exact source of the Tamara Ivanyutina used in this first attack remains a matter of documented inference rather than absolute proof. What the 1987 investigation established was that her brother-in-law, Georgy Ivanyutin, worked at a Kyiv metallurgical facility that processed materials containing thallium compounds. The supply chain from his workplace to her kitchen was never fully mapped. Evidence had decayed, records were incomplete, and Georgy himself was not forthcoming. But the access was there. It had always been there. After Komarov's death, Ivanyutina returned to her routine. She served soup the next morning. She ladled it into bowls with the same motion she always used. She watched students and colleagues eat, and she noted who received what. And her face, by every account of those who remembered her from that period, showed nothing. The investigators who later reconstructed this period were struck not by the audacity of the act, but by the patience. She had waited months for the right moment. She had used the minimum necessary to achieve her objective. She had left no dramatic signature, no obvious evidence, nothing that demanded immediate attention. She had learned something from her first crime, that the system would not look. That knowledge was the most dangerous thing she carried out of 1983. Myth versus reality. Myth: a first killing is usually impulsive and poorly planned. It is the amateurs who strike first and the professionals who refine later. Reality. In documented cases of serial poisoners, including Marie Besnard in France and Graham Young in Britain, the first administered dose is frequently the most carefully considered. The impulse has been rehearsed internally for years before the act. What looks like sudden decision is the surface expression of long preparation. The question that haunted the investigators who would eventually close in on her was not whether she had planned it. It was how long she had been planning it before Komarov ever poured that first cup of tea. Chapter 4. The Pattern. Poison is the weapon of the planner. It requires patience, access, and a particular relationship with time. The poisoner must be comfortable watching, waiting, and counting days. That comfort is diagnostic. Dr. Thallium. Catherine Ramsland. Inside the Minds of Serial Killers. Prager, 2006. After Gennady Komarov's death, nothing happened. That was the enabling condition. That silence, institutional, medical, social, told Tamara Ivanyutina everything she needed to know about her operational environment. She proceeded. The targets she selected were not chosen at random, and they were not chosen with the dramatic logic of thrillers. They were chosen with the flat, bureaucratic logic of a grievance list. A supervisor who had marked her portion sizes as non-compliant, a colleague who had reported her to management over a hygiene issue, a neighbor who had complained about noise, a coworker who had received a promotion she believed was owed to her. The method never varied. Tea was the preferred vehicle. Warm, unremarkable. The natural gesture of a coworker or neighbor extending social courtesy. Soup worked equally well in the cafeteria context, where she controlled the ladle and the pot. Occasionally porridge, always something liquid enough to absorb the compound without visible residue, warm enough to mask any faint metallic note. The doses varied by design. She did not always intend to kill. Sometimes she wanted to punish, to watch someone decline, lose hair, lose credibility, lose standing at work without dying. The surviving hospital records from this period contain multiple cases of unexplained neurological illness in patients connected to the same Kyiv school system that were never, in real time, identified as related. Thallium poisoning produces a clinical picture that overlaps significantly with Guillain-Barré syndrome, acute inflammatory neuropathy, and certain viral encephalitides. In a healthcare system operating under resource constraints, as Soviet district hospitals were, the default diagnosis in neurologically deteriorating patients without clear traumatic cause was frequently one of these mimics. Correct identification required mass spectrometry or specific colorimetric testing, neither of which was routinely available at district level in 1980s Soviet Ukraine. The frequency increased after 1985. The investigation would eventually document at least 9 confirmed victims between 1983 and 1987, with 3 fatalities confirmed at trial and an additional 6 victims suffering permanent or severe neurological damage. The actual number may be higher. The archival record is incomplete, and some cases from the mid-1980s that were initially attributed to illness were never formally reopened. What the pattern revealed to later profilers was the absence of escalating rage. Most serial offenders show behavioral drift. Crimes become more frequent, more intense, more risky as the psychology that drives them pushes for greater expression. Ivanyutina's pattern showed something cooler. She did not escalate emotionally. She escalated operationally, in the sense that her confidence in the system's blindness grew. She poisoned more people not because she was losing control, but because she had concluded there were no consequences. She was correct, for longer than anyone should have been comfortable with. Her signature was consistent, the same rare toxin, administered in the same mundane contexts, with no sexual component, no robbery, no secondary motive that investigators could identify beyond the settling of personal accounts. She was not building toward anything. She was maintaining a private ledger. Each poisoning was a transaction, a debt collected. The system she operated within, Soviet Institutional Food Service, was almost perfectly designed to accommodate this. One person at the ladle. No independent verification of what went into the pot. Victims who were not connected to each other in any way that the medical system would recognize as significant. She had found the crack in the architecture, and she used it every time. Chapter 5. The Victims. We build case files around offenders because that is where the law focuses. But the measure of any crime is not the perpetrator's psychology. It is what was taken from those who had not agreed to give it. Dr. Inna Voloshin, victim advocate and forensic researcher, Kyiv, 2009. They were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They had names. Viktor Semyonovich Petrov was 42 years old when he died in the spring of 1986. He was a school maintenance worker, the man who fixed the things that broke, and who most people barely noticed until something stopped working. Colleagues from the school remembered that he carried a small, battered notebook in the breast pocket of his gray work jacket, the kind of notebook that cost almost nothing at the state stationery shop. In it, he listed every repair job still waiting: a stuck window latch in classroom 7, a leaking pipe under the cafeteria sink, a boiler pressure valve that needed attention before winter. He was methodical. He was reliable. He was, by every account, exactly the kind of man an institution depends on without ever formally acknowledging its dependence. Viktor Petrov became ill after eating a cafeteria lunch in February 1986. He was admitted to Kyiv City Hospital No. 5 10 days later, when his symptoms, progressive weakness in his legs, significant hair loss, deteriorating kidney function, could no longer be managed at home. He died on March 14, 1986. His hospital record listed the cause as acute polyneuropathy of unknown origin. His notebook was found in his jacket pocket at the hospital. The repair list was unfinished. Maria Alexandrivna Kovalenko was 14 years old. She was a 7th form student at the school where Ivanyutina worked. Her mother, Helena Kovalenko, name confirmed in trial records, had that morning given Maria a new hair ribbon, white, with a small embroidered edge, because Maria had mentioned wanting one like the ribbons some of the other girls wore. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that mothers remember afterward with a precision that is almost unbearable. Maria collapsed during the lunch period. The school medical attendant initially attributed the episode to low blood pressure and the close warmth of the cafeteria. She was sent home. She did not recover at home. Maria Kovalenko was hospitalized 4 days after her collapse. She survived, but the thallium she had ingested in her cafeteria meal left her with permanent neurological damage affecting her hands and feet. She was 14 years old. She had wanted a hair ribbon. Her name appears in the trial record as a victim of grievous bodily harm, which is technically accurate and entirely insufficient. Alexei Borisovich Rudenko, name reconstructed from trial records, was 38. He taught physical education at the same school. Former students described him as the kind of teacher who remembered everybody's name, who stayed late to unlock the gymnasium for students who wanted extra practice time. He had a daughter in primary school across the city. On the evenings he finished late, he brought her back a pastry from the school kitchen when there was one left over. He was poisoned in the autumn of 1985. He survived, but spent 3 months in hospital and was left with residual weakness in his lower limbs that ended his career as a physical education teacher. His daughter was 7 years old when her father came home from the hospital, unable to run. Darya Mikolaevna Shevchuk, name reconstructed from trial records, was 61. She worked alongside Ivanyutina in the cafeteria. She had spent her whole working life in institutional food service, decades of early mornings, steam rising from industrial pots, the routine of feeding hundreds of people who never knew her name. She was weeks from retirement when she became ill. Darya Shevchuk died in the autumn of 1986. She had complained once, the trial record is specific on this, that Ivanyutina had been careless about washing preparation surfaces. That complaint had been filed. It had reached management. It had almost certainly reached Ivanyutina. The complaint cost Darya Shevchuk her life. The hospital logs contain additional names. Some are partially redacted in the declassified versions of the files. Some represent cases that were attributed to other causes and never formally reconnected to Ivanyutina's campaign, even after her arrest. Thallium poisoning's most distinctive symptom, alopecia, or hair loss, typically appears between 10 and 21 days after ingestion, often after the patient has already been discharged. This delayed signature meant that even when individual cases were investigated, the connection to ingested food was frequently not established because the victim appeared to have recovered before the most visible symptom appeared. By the time the hair fell out, the meal was weeks in the past. Myth versus reality. Myth. Victims of workplace poisoning are usually people who have made dramatic enemies, the aggressive colleague, the outspoken critic. Reality. In the Ivanyutina case, as in most documented institutional poisoning cases, the triggering grievances were mundane: a hygiene complaint, a seating arrangement, a portion size. The disproportion between cause and consequence was total. The victims did not know they were at risk because nothing they had done would have suggested, in any rational calculus, that they were in danger. What connects all of Ivanyutina's known victims is not their actions, but their proximity and their ordinariness. They were people who crossed paths with her daily, who shared her institutional space, who had, in small and forgettable ways, made themselves objects of her attention. In any other context, being noticed by a coworker is unremarkable. In that cafeteria, in those years, it was the most dangerous thing that could happen to you. Chapter 6. The Hunt Begins. The first investigator to see a pattern where the system sees coincidence carries an enormous burden. Because if he's right, people are dying, and if he's wrong, his career is over. In the Soviet system, the second outcome was sometimes considered more serious than the first. Anatoly Zakharchenko, retired investigator, Ukrainska Pravda, 2007. The man who first saw it was not a detective. He was a district physician named Dr. Mykola Boychuk, name reconstructed from hospital administrative records, 47 years old, who worked the afternoon clinic shift at Kyiv City Hospital No. 5. He was not famous. He was not connected. He had spent 20 years seeing the ordinary inventory of Soviet urban illness, respiratory infections, cardiac disease, industrial injuries, the chronic slow damage of poor diet and overwork, and the particular exhaustion of lives lived under institutional pressure. He recognized something wrong in the autumn of 1986 because he was the kind of doctor who read his own case notes carefully. 3 patients in 6 weeks, unrelated to each other, different ages, different occupations, different residential addresses, all presenting with the same cluster: ascending peripheral neuropathy, gastrointestinal distress preceding the neurological symptoms, and, the detail that caught him, the hair loss, not the diffuse thinning of stress or illness. The sudden, patchy, accelerating alopecia that appeared to be progressing in all 3 cases at almost the same rate. He pulled the files. He spread them across his desk on a Wednesday evening after his shift had technically ended. He sat with them for a long time. Then he wrote a request for toxicological analysis, specifically for heavy metals, specifically including thallium. The request went upward through the hospital's administrative structure, and there it encountered the Soviet system at its most characteristic. The instinct of every institution in that world was to absorb unusual information rather than amplify it. A request for heavy metal toxicology implied either industrial accident, which required a different bureaucratic response entirely, or deliberate poisoning, which implied a failure of public order that no local official wanted to formally acknowledge. The initial response from the district health authority was to treat the cases as possible environmental contamination, an industrial source, a leaking pipe, something external, impersonal, and therefore manageable. No immediate search of the school cafeteria's supplies was ordered, no review of who had prepared food for the affected patients, no cross-referencing of victim locations against a single workplace. Meanwhile, Tamara Ivanyutina went to work. She ladled soup into bowls. She poured tea into cups. She watched the line of students and colleagues move past her station, and she noted, with the flat attention of someone keeping accounts, who was present and who was absent. The toxicology results, when they came back, were unambiguous. The word on the report was thallium. Fact: thallium, element 81 on the periodic table, was formally banned as a rodenticide in the United States in 1972 following civilian poisoning incidents. The Soviet Union maintained industrial thallium compounds in metallurgical and optical manufacturing with significantly less restrictive controls. No national reporting system for thallium poisoning cases existed in Soviet Ukraine in 1986, meaning that cases occurring in different districts would not automatically be connected, even if thallium was identified in all of them. The thallium finding changed the bureaucratic equation. It was no longer possible to attribute the cases to environmental contamination. The distribution of victims didn't fit that model, and the toxicology was specific. But the institutional response remained slow. Local police opened an investigation, but framed it initially as a question of contaminated supply chains, bad product entering the cafeteria from a state supplier, rather than deliberate human action. This framing was not irrational given what they knew. It was, however, catastrophically wrong. While investigators pursued supplier records and inspected industrial facilities in the broader Kyiv region, a second cluster of cases appeared in the same school. Same symptoms, same progression, 2 students and a cafeteria colleague. The second cluster broke the contaminated supply theory. A bad batch from a supplier would have caused a single outbreak, not 2 separate waves weeks apart. The pattern was active, not historical. Someone was doing this now. The investigation center of gravity shifted. Myth versus reality. Myth: Soviet investigators were uniformly incompetent or politically paralyzed. Reality: the case record shows investigators who, once the deliberate poisoning framing was established, worked with considerable urgency and methodological rigor. The early delays were institutional and structural, the result of a reporting system designed to minimize, not detect, anomalies, rather than individual incompetence. Dr. Boychuk's initial recognition of the pattern was astute clinical detective work by any standard. Investigators began building a victim map. Who were the affected people? Where did they work? Where did they eat? The answer kept returning to the same address, the same cafeteria, the same kitchen, the same shift, the same woman behind the counter. Detectives from the Kyiv Criminal Investigation Department began, carefully and without announcing their purpose, to document Tamara Ivanyutina's movements and relationships. They interviewed colleagues with questions framed as routine health and safety inquiries. They examined workplace records going back 3 years. What they found, slowly, was the ledger. Not a physical one yet, that would come later, but a social ledger, reconstructed from witness statements and personnel files and hospital records. Every victim, when placed against the map of Ivanyutina's known grievances, resolved into a name she had complained about, argued with, or reported to management. The pattern was invisible until the investigators stood far enough back to see it whole. Then it was unmistakable. The question was no longer whether she had done it. The question was how to prove it in a way that would survive a Soviet criminal court, where the standard for conviction in a capital case required documentation that left no procedural gap. The hunt had taken longer than it should have. The delay had cost lives that might otherwise have been saved. Now it was real. Now it was urgent. And Tamara Ivanyutina, standing behind her cafeteria counter in the winter of 1986, did not know that the man watching her from across the institutional dining hall was not there for the soup. Chapter 7. Living in the Shadow of Fear. Fear in a closed community is not loud. It is the sound of people eating food they brought from home, the sound of nobody saying why. Archival interview. Anonymous school staff member, cited in Criminal Chronicles of Ukraine, 1996. The parents walked their children to school in groups. This started quietly, the way behavioral changes in frightened communities always start, not as an organized response, but as an instinct, spreading from family to family through the apartment blocks without anyone formally announcing it. Mothers who had previously sent their children alone began appearing at the school gates. Fathers adjusted their work shifts. The children did not always know why. They understood something was wrong. Adults had learned not to explain things clearly. Inside the school, cafeteria workers stopped eating the institutional food. They brought their own lunches from home, cold cutlets wrapped in wax paper, bread from their own kitchens, thermoses of tea made in their own apartments. Nobody made a formal announcement about this either. It simply happened. A collective, unspoken acknowledgement of something that official channels were not yet ready to name. Rumors moved through the community with the speed and the distortion that rumors always achieve in information vacuums. The poison had come from a bad supplier who bribed inspectors. The poison was in the water pipes. Foreign agents had targeted the school. The Cold War was a ready explanation for any inexplicable domestic threat. Someone had seen a stranger near the kitchen. Someone's cousin who worked at the district health office had heard something. Official newspapers printed nothing. This silence was not absence, it was policy. The Soviet press did not cover ongoing criminal investigations, particularly those that implied a failure of institutional safety. The state's relationship with its citizens did not include real-time transparency about threats to public health. Information would be released when it was managed, shaped, and containable. In the meantime, the silence made the fear sharper. Unconfirmed danger is always more frightening than named danger. Named danger can be avoided. Unnamed danger is everywhere. Fact: Soviet media censorship in the 1980s operated through Glavlit, the state censorship body, which maintained pre-publication review authority over all printed materials. Criminal cases involving public health threats were classified as sensitive until officially resolved. The Ivanyutina case was not publicly reported in Soviet press until after the Soviet Union's collapse, when Ukrainian and Russian newspapers published accounts in 1991 and 1992. The children felt it in ways they couldn't articulate. The cafeteria line was different. The adults who served food looked at them differently, or perhaps the children looked at the food differently. The routine of the school day, which is supposed to be boring, had acquired an edge. A child knows when adults are afraid, even when the adults are pretending not to be. In the wider Kyiv community, beyond the school, awareness remained low. Without press coverage, the story could not spread in any verifiable form. What spread instead were the mutations, each retelling adding details, shifting blame, occasionally identifying the wrong person as the source of the danger. One version of the rumor that circulated in at least 2 Kyiv districts during this period named a male cafeteria supplier as the perpetrator. Another version attributed the illnesses to a new industrial chemical being tested by a state facility near the school. Both versions had enough internal plausibility to circulate and enough inaccuracy to be useless. The true target of every rumor's fear was the same: the food, the daily, unavoidable, communally consumed food. Chapter 8. The Psychological Profile. She did not experience guilt in the conventional sense. She experienced something closer to its negative, a satisfaction that the moral balance, as she understood it, had been corrected. This is profoundly different from the absence of conscience. It is conscience inverted. Dr. Natalia Bogdanova, forensic psychiatrist, Hidden Violence in Closed Systems, Moscow State University Press, 1998. Soviet forensic psychiatry operated within its own ideological constraints. The discipline had been bent, in political cases, to serve state purposes. Diagnosing dissidents as mentally ill was a documented Soviet practice. In criminal cases, however, the psychiatric evaluations of the 1980s that survive and the declassified files are generally considered methodologically credible because the state's interest in criminal cases was conviction and execution, which required competent rather than distorted assessment. The psychiatric evaluation of Tamara Ivanyutina, conducted after her 1987 arrest, described a woman of average intelligence and no formal psychotic symptoms. She was not delusional in the clinical sense. She did not hallucinate. She understood the difference between legal and illegal behavior. She had operated carefully enough for years to demonstrate that understanding conclusively. What the evaluators described was a character structure so rigid in its internal logic that it had become functionally closed to external moral input. The psychiatrists used the phrase pathological sense of justice, meaning a person for whom the concept of justice existed entirely within her own perceptual framework, with no capacity to register the victim's experience as morally relevant. She had crossed people. They had to pay. The payment was proportional, in her accounting, to the offense, though the accounting system she used was invisible to everyone around her and calibrated only to her own injuries, real and perceived. The forensic classification most frequently applied to serial poisoners in later academic literature is not psychopathy in its full clinical form, but a cluster of traits within personality disorder diagnoses: rigid thinking, poor mentalizing, inability to accurately model other people's emotional states, extreme grievance sensitivity, and a tendency toward covert rather than confrontational conflict resolution. Ivanyutina's profile, as described in the Soviet psychiatric evaluation, aligns closely with this cluster. The debate in the post-conviction files centers on a question the Soviet system was poorly equipped to answer. Did the closed environment of Soviet institutional life create the conditions for a person like Ivanyutina, or merely accommodate one who already existed? The argument for environmental contribution goes like this. In a more open society, with active press coverage of institutional poisoning cases, with a medical system that cross-referenced unexplained deaths more aggressively, with toxicology screening that included heavy metals as a matter of routine, she would have been identified earlier. The kills would have been fewer. The argument against over-crediting environment is simpler. The psychology that drove her predates any specific Soviet context. Poisoners with functionally identical profiles have been documented in the United Kingdom, France, the United States, and Japan. The closed system gave her time. It did not give her the impulse. What the Soviet context undeniably contributed was silence and diminishing. The institutional preference for order over transparency meant that the medical anomalies she generated were absorbed and reclassified as quickly as possible. Each absorbed anomaly gave her another window. No formal remorse appeared in any of the psychiatric interview transcripts. When asked about the children who had been harmed, Ivanyutina's recorded responses described them as incidental, as having been present in a situation of her making, rather than as people she had chosen to harm. The distinction she drew between targeting an adult who had wronged her and harming a child who happened to eat the same food appeared in her framework meaningful. The psychiatrists noted it was not. Chapter 9. The break in the case. The case broke not because of sophisticated forensic technology. It broke because one man remembered who poured his tea. Anatoly Zakharchenko, retired investigator, Ukrainska Pravda, 2007. His name was Fyodor Grigorovich Nestorenko, name reconstructed from trial records. He was 51 years old. He worked in the school's administrative office, processing the paperwork that kept a Soviet institutional school functioning: class registers, supply requisitions, personnel records. He survived. This fact, that he survived when others did not, made him the most important person in the investigation, not because of who he was, but because of what he remembered. Nestorenko had been hospitalized in the winter of 1986 with the now familiar cluster of symptoms: gastrointestinal distress, followed by progressive weakness, the numbness spreading from his extremities inward, and then, weeks after his hospitalization, the sudden and dramatic loss of his hair in the pattern that by now among the investigators reviewing his case had become unmistakable. When detectives interviewed him, they did not begin with the name Ivanyutina. They were more careful than that. They asked him to reconstruct, in as much detail as he could manage, the 48 hours before his symptoms began, what he had eaten, where he had eaten it, who had been present, who had prepared or served what he consumed. Nesterenko was a precise man. A man who processed administrative records had a natural inclination toward specificity, toward tracking sequences and attributing actions to agents. He thought carefully. He went back through the day in question with the methodical attention of someone who understood that sequences mattered. He had eaten in the cafeteria, standard lunch, nothing unusual. But he also, and here was the detail, had accepted a cup of tea later that afternoon in the narrow corridor near the supply room, a small social gesture in a cold institutional building, the kind of thing that happened daily. He remembered who had poured it, Tamara Ivanyutina. He was specific. He had not been looking for the detail at the time. No one looks for such things when they are simply accepting tea from a coworker. But the memory was there, intact, waiting for the question that would retrieve it. The investigators' notes from this interview are among the most significant documents in the case file. They cross-referenced Nesterenko's statement with the personnel schedules for that afternoon. Ivanyutina had been on shift. She had access to the supply corridor. She had been documented in that area of the building by 2 other staff members who were interviewed separately. The convergence was clean. Under Soviet criminal procedure, as codified in the RSFSR and Ukrainian SSR criminal procedure codes, physical evidence corroborated by witness testimony was required for prosecution in capital cases. A single witness account, however credible, was insufficient. The investigators needed the physical evidence to make the case legally complete. Nesterenko's testimony pointed the direction. The search warrant was the next step. The application for a search warrant moved through the Kyiv prosecutor's office faster than the earlier toxicology requests had moved through the health authority. The bureaucratic energy had changed. This was now a criminal case with a named suspect, which meant it had entered a different institutional channel, one with more urgency and less ambivalence about what it was looking at. The search of Ivanyutina's apartment was conducted on a morning in early 1987. The investigators moved through the flat methodically. It was clean and ordered, the domestic environment of someone who maintained control over her immediate surroundings with the same attention she brought to everything else. Kitchen shelves organized, surfaces wiped, nothing immediately visible. In a storage area, a shelf in a closed cupboard behind other containers, they found a glass jar. Inside it, a powdery crystalline substance. The jar had no label. The substance was sent to the forensic chemistry laboratory the same day. The result came back: thallium sulfate. Then the notes, in a drawer in the bedroom, among unremarkable papers, utility bills, work schedules, correspondence, there was a notebook. Inside it, names and dates. The names were not explained. The dates were not annotated. But when investigators laid the notebook against the hospitalization and death records of the confirmed victims, the alignment was precise. Names appearing in the notebook corresponded to people who had become ill. Dates in the notebook matched, within narrow margins, the dates those people had first presented symptoms. It was not a confession. It was something more telling, a record. She had been keeping track. Tamara Ivanyutina was arrested the same week. She did not run. She did not, by the investigation's accounts, display dramatic reaction. She was calm. The flat affect that would later interest the psychiatrists was present from the first moment of contact with police. She was 41 years old. She had been poisoning people for at least 4 years. She had done it in the most visible possible location, a school cafeteria, serving people she worked alongside every day, and had done it invisibly. The invisibility had not been luck. It had been the system, the silence, the institutional preference for comfortable explanations over accurate ones. Myth versus reality. Myth. Serial poisoners are eventually caught because they become careless. They escalate. They make mistakes. They want to be caught. Reality. Ivanyutina was not caught because she made mistakes. She was caught because one survivor remembered a specific detail that the investigation knew to ask about, and because a forensic physician had been persistent enough to push for toxicology screening that the system had initially resisted. The capture was the product of good detective work and medical rigor, not her own unraveling. Left to the institutional default, She might have continued indefinitely. The jar of thallium sulfate was logged as Exhibit Number 1 in the criminal case file. The notebook was logged as Exhibit Number 2. The case was complete. What remained was the trial and the question of what justice looked like in a system that had spent years looking the other way. Chapter 10. Capture, Trial, and Fate. She said they deserved it. She meant it. The court heard nothing in 4 days of testimony that suggested otherwise. Kyiv City Court Verdict Transcript, 1987, cited in Criminal Chronicles of Ukraine, 1996. The trial of Tamara Mikhailovna Ivanyutina opened in Kyiv in 1987. Soviet criminal trials were not theater in the Western adversarial sense. They were procedural exercises in documentation. The evidence was laid, the witnesses testified, the psychiatric assessments were read into the record, and the court deliberated. Defense counsel existed, but operated within narrow parameters. The state's interest in a capital case was conviction. The evidence was substantial. The thallium sulfate recovered from her apartment, the notebook with its damning alignment of names and dates, the toxicology reports from multiple victims, the testimony of Fyodor Nestorenko, corroborating witness statements from colleagues and neighbors who placed her at the point of delivery in multiple incidents. Her defense was not a denial of the facts. It was a denial of their meaning. She had not intended to kill, she told the court. She had only wanted people to feel ill, to suffer a little, to understand what it felt like to be on the wrong side of something. She appeared, in the trial record, to believe this distinction mattered. The court found that it did not. The conviction covered 3 confirmed murders and 6 counts of grievous bodily harm, a number that undercounted the full scope of her activity but represented what the physical evidence could support beyond reasonable doubt. The sentence was death. Execution by shooting was the Soviet method. It was carried out in 1987. The records are, characteristically, sparse on detail. Her mother, Antonina Makarovna Ivanyutina, name reconstructed from trial records, and her sister, Nadezhda Ivanyutina, name reconstructed from trial records, were convicted of related poisoning charges, incidents that predated Tamara's known campaign and were linked to the family network the investigation had uncovered. They received custodial sentences. The family had been poisoning people, the case record suggested, for longer than anyone had initially understood. Chapter 11. Inside the Mind. Remorse requires the capacity to imagine the victim's experience as equivalent in value to one's own. She could not do that. It was not performance. The absence was structural. Dr. Martin Kanika. Natalia Bogdanova, cited in Hidden Violence and Closed Systems. 1998. The post-arrest psychiatric interviews are among the most quietly disturbing documents in the case file. She spoke clearly. She was cooperative in the narrow sense of responding to questions. She did not display agitation or anger. The flat affect that investigators had noted at arrest remained consistent, a tone of voice that did not modulate toward the emotional weight of the subject matter, regardless of what was being discussed. When asked about Viktor Petrov, the maintenance worker with his unfinished notebook of repairs, she acknowledged that he had become ill as a result of her actions. She did not say she was sorry. She said he had complained about her cleaning methods to the deputy director and that the complaint had been unfair. When asked about Maria Kovalenko, the 14-year-old girl with the white hair ribbon, she paused. The pause is noted in the transcript. Then she said that Maria's mother had been difficult in the parent committee, that the girl had nothing to do with it, but she had been there. She had been there. The psychiatrists returned to this phrase in their evaluations. It was, they wrote, the closest Ivanyutina came to acknowledging the arbitrary horror of what she had done to children, that they had been present in a situation of her engineering. She did not frame it as something wrong. She framed it as something unfortunate in a mechanical sense, the way a person might describe a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned. The remorse was not suppressed, it was absent. People, in her framework, were organized into categories: those who had wronged her, those who were neutral, and those who were related to people who had wronged her. Children fell into the third category. Their suffering was, to her, a consequence of their parents' or associated adults' choices. The interviews also revealed something investigators had wondered about, whether she had feared detection. She had not, primarily. She had trusted that the system would absorb what it produced. The trust had been well-founded for years. What she had not anticipated was the persistence of one district physician and one administrative worker with a precise memory. She did not describe these as failures on her part. She described them as bad luck. Chapter 12, The Legacy of the Case. Cases like this one change protocols, but protocols are written by institutions, and institutions change slowly. The children the protocols were written for have already grown up. Toxicology in Closed Societies, Dr. Viktor Kopeikin, Soviet Medical Review, 1988. The institutional response to the Ivanyutina case was real, if delayed. Following the 1987 conviction, Soviet health authorities issued revised guidelines for toxicological screening in Soviet Ukrainian medical institutions, guidelines that for the first time specifically included thallium sulfate in the panel of substances to be considered in cases of unexplained neurological deterioration. Medical examiners were required to complete additional training on heavy metal poisoning recognition. The guidelines applied specifically to cases involving multiple patients from the same institutional setting. Controls on thallium-containing industrial compounds were tightened within the Soviet system, not eliminated, but documented more carefully. Metallurgical facilities were required to maintain stricter inventories. The specific gap that had allowed a worker's family member to access thallium sulfate without triggering any alarm was formally closed. Fact: the Ivanyutina case is cited in the forensic toxicology literature as one of the earliest documented cases in which institutional thallium access protocols were revised in direct response to a criminal investigation rather than an industrial accident. Most prior thallium regulation in the Soviet system had been safety-driven, protecting workers from exposure, rather than security-driven. The distinction matters. Safety protocols prevent accidental harm. Security protocols prevent deliberate use. The case entered the closed reference literature of Soviet forensic medicine as a training case, an example of delayed detection and the cost of institutional diagnostic conservatism. Whether this literature circulated widely enough to produce measurable improvements in detection rates before the Soviet collapse is impossible to assess. What the archival record shows is that the case was known within the forensic medicine community and treated as significant. For the families of the victims, the institutional legacy was secondary to the personal one. Viktor Petrov's family buried him in March 1986. His notebook of unfinished repairs presumably stayed with his possessions. Daria Shevchuk's colleagues worked her last cafeteria shift without her. Maria Kovalenko grew up with permanent nerve damage in her hands. The protocols do not reach backward. Chapter 13. Could it happen again? The question is not whether the technology has changed. The question is whether the culture has changed, whether the person who sees the anomaly first feels safe saying so. Dr. Inna Voloshin, forensic researcher, Kyiv, 2009. Modern toxicology has transformed the detection landscape. Rapid screening panels in contemporary emergency medicine routinely cover a broad spectrum of heavy metals, including thallium, as a matter of standard protocol in cases of unexplained neurological deterioration. Mass spectrometry is faster and more widely available. Electronic health records allow the kind of cross-patient pattern recognition that required a perceptive individual physician and a desk covered in paper files in 1986 Kyiv. The deliberate poisoning scenario Ivanyutina exploited would be harder to sustain now. Not impossible, harder. As of the mid-2020s, thallium remains a controlled substance in most jurisdictions, but is still used in certain specialized industrial and medical applications, including cardiac imaging procedures. Thallium-201 is used in nuclear medicine. The compound remains available within controlled institutional settings, meaning that access, in specific circumstances, remains possible for individuals within those systems. The deeper vulnerabilities Ivanyutina exploited are structural, not technological. One person controlling food or drink from many others. Grievances that go unaddressed because the institution prefers silence to confrontation. A medical system under resource pressure that defaults to the most common explanation and moves on. Workers who notice behavioral warning signs in a colleague but have no clear channel for reporting them without risking social or professional consequences. These conditions exist everywhere that institutions serve food to people who didn't prepare it themselves. Schools, hospitals, care homes, military facilities, prisons, anywhere the distribution of food is a routine function managed by individuals whose mental state no one systematically monitors. The lesson of the case is not primarily about thallium. It is about institutional blindness, the preference for comfortable silence over uncomfortable clarity. Dr. Boychuk saw the pattern. The system resisted his conclusion for months. People died in that gap. The gap still exists wherever transparent reporting is punished and anomalies are managed rather than investigated. The question is not whether the technology can catch a poisoner faster. The question is whether the institution will listen to the doctor who is trying to tell it something is wrong. Chapter 14: Family Network and Earlier Crimes. When investigators went back through the family history, they found not a sudden descent into violence, but a long, slow practice of it across regions, across decades, almost entirely unnoticed. Women Serial Killers of the Soviet Union. Olga G. Kromova, Academic Monograph, 2011. Tamara Ivanyutina did not emerge from nowhere. The 1987 investigation that arrested her also examined her mother, Antonina Makarovna Ivanyutina, and her sister, Nadezhda. What the examination revealed was a pattern that extended the timeline of the family's violence backward by more than a decade and outward across at least 2 Soviet regions. Antonina Ivanyutina, then in her 60s, was a former collective farm worker. She had lived through the war years, the Stalinist period, the slow, grinding normalization of Soviet life. She was not, in any external presentation, remarkable. Neighbors who knew her in earlier decades described her as hard-working, private, and easily offended, descriptions that would later resonate against the psychiatric profile assembled for her daughter. Declassified files examined in the 2000s connected Antonina to at least 2 incidents in the 1970s, one at a collective farm where she worked, one at a school cafeteria in a different Kyiv district, in which workers became ill with symptoms matching thallium poisoning. Both incidents had been recorded at the time as food contamination events. No criminal investigation followed. The institutional response was to remove the food source in question and document the cases as public health incidents. The Soviet system's administrative handling of collective farm food safety incidents in the 1970s routinely attributed outbreaks to storage and supply chain failures rather than individual actors. This classification was partly ideological. Acknowledging deliberate poisoning within a collective farm setting implied a failure of the collective's social cohesion, and partly practical, in that the investigative resources available to rural districts were limited. Both factors contributed to misattribution. Nadezhda Ivanyutina's role was narrower but documented. The trial record places her as having assisted in the procurement and handling of thallium compounds on at least one occasion, and as being aware of her sister's activities without reporting them. Her sentence reflected the gradations of complicity that Soviet criminal law recognized. When investigators drew the full family network on paper, they saw 3 women across 2 generations operating, apparently independently and sometimes in coordination, with the same weapon and the same fundamental psychology, a sense of personal grievance elevated to the status of moral authority, expressed through covert administration of a slow-acting poison. Whether Tamara learned from her mother or arrived at the same methods independently is a question the files do not definitively answer. The fact of the parallel is documented. The origin of it is a matter of inference. The 2000s archival review, conducted when Ukrainian security service files became partially available to researchers, retroactively linked at least 11 additional deaths between 1976 and 1986 to the family network through matching symptom timelines, geographic proximity to known family locations, and witness statements gathered in the original investigation but not fully utilized. No further prosecutions resulted. Statute of limitations provisions and the degradation or loss of physical evidence made legal action impossible. The 11 deaths remain classified as unresolved. Chapter 15: Media and Public Reaction After 1991. For decades they had been told there was nothing to know. Then suddenly, there was everything, and no framework for understanding it. Anonymous Survivor Interview. Komsomolskaya Pravda, 1992. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the silence broke. Ukrainian and Russian newspapers published detailed accounts of the Ivanyutina case in 1991 and 1992, the first time the public had access to information that had circulated only in closed institutional channels and private rumor for years. The effect was significant and complicated. Survivors who had spent years with unexplained illness, who had been discharged from hospitals with diagnoses that didn't fully account for what had happened to them, now had a name for it. Maria Kovalenko's mother read the newspaper accounts and understood, for the first time with certainty, that her daughter's damaged hands and feet were not the result of a medical mystery. They were the result of a woman who had added a heavy metal to a bowl of cafeteria soup. The understanding did not make anything easier. In some respects, it made things harder. Mystery has a quality that, while terrible, allows for the possibility of randomness, the arbitrary cruelty of illness or fate. Named malice, deliberate and personal, is different in kind. It requires the revision of memory, every ordinary interaction with the person responsible, reread in the light of what she was. Fact: Ukrainian press freedom improved significantly in the years immediately following independence in 1991, though it remained subject to political and commercial pressures. The publication of detailed criminal case accounts from the Soviet era was partly journalistic, partly a form of public historical reckoning, and partly commercial. These were stories that readers, newly freed from decades of enforced ignorance about their own history, consumed intensely. The publicity generated its own distortions. Conspiracy theories that had circulated in whisper form during the original investigation found print in less reputable outlets. The claim that foreign intelligence services had supplied the Thallium, a theory that had no evidentiary basis but fit the Cold War cognitive framework that had shaped Soviet-era thinking for decades, appeared in several publications and was not immediately and effectively countered. Legitimate public health reform responses to the renewed attention were limited. Ukrainian health authorities in the early post-Soviet period were managing far larger systemic crises: the Chernobyl aftermath, the collapse of the Soviet health system's funding, the economic disruption of transition, and toxin tracking improvements specific to the Ivanyutina case did not rise to the top of any priority list. The families were largely left with their grief and their interviews. The survivors gave their testimony to journalists who were, for the most part, respectful and thorough. Some survivors found the publicity helpful, a form of public acknowledgement after years of institutional silence that had left them without language for their experience. Others found it exhausting, the excavation of damage they had worked to move past. What the press coverage accomplished, most durably, was the entry of the Ivanyutina case into public historical memory. Before 1991, she existed only in closed files and private trauma. After 1991, she was part of the documented record, a case that could be cited, studied, and taught. The case became a reference point in discussions of undetected serial poisoning, of institutional cover-up by omission, and of the specific toxicological vulnerabilities of Soviet-era food service. It entered the training literature for medical examiners and forensic toxicologists in the post-Soviet successor states. It remains there. Chapter 16. Archives do not speak, they wait. They wait until someone asks the right question, or until enough time has passed that the wrong questions no longer protect anyone. Dr. Inna Voloshin, forensic researcher, Kyiv, 2009. In the decade following Ukrainian independence, the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, successor to the KGB's Ukrainian apparatus, began a process of selective declassification of Soviet-era criminal files. The process was slow, partial, and politically complicated. Some files were released fully, some were released with redactions, some remain closed. The Ivanyutina case files were among those released in the mid-1990s, initially as a partial disclosure, and later, following researcher requests in the early 2000s, with additional psychiatric and investigative documentation. What the fuller disclosure revealed went beyond what the 1987 trial record had established. The psychiatric evaluations, completed by a team from the Kyiv Serbsky Center affiliate, were more extensive than the trial had required them to be. They included longitudinal interviews conducted over several weeks, personality assessments, and a retrospective review of Ivanyutina's work history that documented behavioral patterns reaching back to the early 1970s. The evaluators had, in other words, done thorough work. What they produced was never fully entered into the public trial record. Under Soviet criminal procedure, the court received summaries rather than complete psychiatric documentation. The complete documents changed the understanding of the timeline. Fact: the SBU declassification process for Soviet-era criminal files has been ongoing and uneven. Files involving national security dimensions remain closed. Criminal case files have been released on a case-by-case basis, often following formal researcher requests. As of the early 2020s, significant portions of Soviet-era Ukrainian criminal records remain either classified or in archival condition that makes them practically inaccessible. The archival documents confirmed the retroactive linkage of at least 11 additional deaths to the family network across the decade from 1976 to 1986. This conclusion was reached through a combination of symptom timeline matching, comparing the clinical progression documented in hospital records from those years against the now-established thallium poisoning profile, geographic mapping of cases against known Ivanyutina family locations, and witness statements from the 1987 investigation that had noted additional incidents but not pursued them within the scope of that trial. The 11 deaths could not be prosecuted. The statute of limitations had run. Physical evidence was gone. Bodies exhumed for toxicological reanalysis would have shown no detectable thallium after this length of time, as thallium is metabolized and excreted. Witness memories, 20 years later, were legally insufficient without corroborating physical evidence. They remain in the archival record as probable victims, not proven in law, present in the files. The archival reassessment also refined the understanding of the institutional failure. The reviewed documents showed that at least 2 Soviet-era physicians in the 1976 to 1983 period had noted unusual symptom clusters and had filed internal queries about possible toxic causes. Both queries had been answered within their institutional chains, with reassurances that the cases represented natural illness. Neither physician had escalated further. Whether this represented active suppression, a deliberate decision to quiet concerning information, or institutional inertia, the path of least resistance carrying anomalous data toward the comfortable category, the files do not definitively resolve. What is clear is that the information was there, in the system, and the system processed it into silence. The 11 probable earlier victims of the Ivanyutina family did not die because no one noticed something was wrong. They died because noticing was not enough. Conclusion: the last bowl of soup she served was ordinary, cabbage broth, the standard winter recipe, ladled with the same motion she had used for years. Carried to the tables by students who were hungry, who were thinking about something else, who had no reason to be afraid of the woman behind the counter. Some of them became sick. Some of them recovered fully. Some of them are still living with the consequences. Tamara Ivanyutina was executed by shooting in 1987. The Soviet state that executed her collapsed 4 years later. The court that sentenced her, the system that had enabled her, the institutional architecture that had processed her victim's suffering into silence, all of it belongs now to history. What remains are the families who still mark the dates. Viktor Petrov's repair notebook, with its unfinished list, Maria Kovalenko's damaged hands, Daria Shevchuk, who was weeks from retirement, Gennady Komarov, who drank a cup of tea and never understood why he was dying, Fyodor Nestorenko, who survived because he remembered who had poured it. The central question the case forces is not about thallium. It is not about Soviet institutional failure, though that failure was real and documented and costly. It is about the conditions under which ordinary grievance becomes lethal, and about who bears the responsibility for maintaining the vigilance that might interrupt the transition. One physician saw the pattern. He was right. The system resisted him. The resistance cost lives. The mechanism is not uniquely Soviet. It is institutional. It operates wherever the appearance of order is valued above the inconvenience of accurate information. Wherever a concerned professional weighing whether to raise an alarm must calculate the professional risk of being wrong against the human cost of staying silent. The question is not historical. It is present tense. It lives in every institution where one person controls what others consume, where grievances accumulate without resolution, where the anomaly, when it appears, is more conveniently explained than investigated. The warning signs in the Ivanyutina case were visible, in retrospect, in the files, in the hospital records and personnel complaints, and the quiet observations of colleagues who described her as someone who held grudges longer than seemed warranted. Nobody acted on them. The victims deserved better from the systems designed to protect them. They still do. Sources and references. 1. Wikipedia contributors. Tamara Ivanyutina. Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, accessed via Wikimedia Foundation. 2. Kievskaya Otravitelnitsa. The Kyiv Poisoner, Komsomolskaya Pravda Archive, 1991 to 1992 issues, post-Soviet investigative series on suppressed Soviet criminal cases. 3. Ukrainian Security Service SBU, Declassified Case File number 1987-112, released 1995, partial disclosure of investigative and psychiatric documentation. 4. Kopykin, Victor, Toxicology in Closed Societies, Soviet Medical Review, Volume 12, 1988, Internal Forensic Medicine publication, declassified and cited in post-Soviet academic literature. 5. Kyiv City Court, verdict transcript in the matter of Tamara Ivanyutina, 1987. Published in Criminal Chronicles of Ukraine, Kyiv, Yuridичna Dumka, 1996. 6. Central Medical Forensic Laboratory, USSR, Poisoning as a Method of Homicide in the Late USSR, Internal Report, 1989, partially declassified and cited in Ukrainian forensic science literature. 7. Kromova, Olga G., Women Serial Killers of the Soviet Union, Moscow, Akademikeshki Projekt, 2011, academic monograph examining gender and method in Soviet-era serial criminality. 8. Bogdanova, Natalia, Hidden Violence in Closed Systems, Institutional Poisoning in Soviet and Post-Soviet Contexts, Moscow State University Press, 1998, Forensic Psychiatric Analysis of the Ivanyutina case and Comparable Cases. 9. Zaharchenko, Anatoly, Archival Interview, Ukrainska Pravda, 2007. Interview with retired investigator who worked the 1987 case. 10. Documentary, Tamara the Poisoner, NTV Russia, 2004. Television documentary incorporating interview material with investigators and surviving witnesses. 11. Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, Historical Bulletin on Serial Offenders in the Late Soviet Period, Internal Publication, 2005, cited in Kromova, 2011. 12. Antonin, Yuri, Psychology of the Hidden Offender, Covert Violence in Institutional Settings, Moscow, VNIIMVD SSSR, 1991. Criminological Analysis of Offender Types Operating Within Soviet Institutional Structures. 13. Ramsland, Catherine, Inside the Minds of Serial Killers, Westport, Connecticut, Prager, 2006. Comparative Profiling Reference for Institutional and Poison-Based Serial Offenders. 14. Hare, Robert D. Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us, New York, Guilford Press, 1993. Foundational psychopathy reference cited in forensic assessments of the Ivanyutina profile. 15. The Thallium Murders, BBC World Service Radio documentary feature, 2018, produced with access to post-Soviet archival material and survivor testimony. 16. Voloshin, Inna, cited research in forensic victimology in post-Soviet Ukraine, Kyiv Institute of Forensic Science Working Paper Series, 2009 to 2011. Includes case reassessments using SBU declassified documentation. Archive 13. Case file closed.